Some men go to war and return home to peace. I came home to a war I didn't see coming. My name is Felix Fisher. I'm 48 years old and I make my living keeping people safe, people who can afford it at least. Before this, I spent 20 years in places most men wouldn't last a week, places where mistakes got people killed. I left the military after one of those mistakes. Now, I run a small security consulting firm out of Missoula, Montana, where I teach rich businessmen and politicians how to keep their families from getting kidnapped. I came home late that night. Work had been slow, so I'd taken a few extra hours out in the backcountry, testing new gear. I liked being alone in the woods. The silence made sense. What didn't make sense was the envelope sitting on my kitchen counter, addressed to me in handwriting I didn't recognize. Molly must have brought in the mail. She wasn't home yet, which was unusual. I opened the envelope. Inside, a single photograph. Molly, my wife of 23 years, sitting in a cafe, leaning in close to a man I knew. Samuel Lewis. I stared at the picture longer than I needed to. The details were all there, the way her hand rested near his, the way he was smiling at her like he had something to offer. I knew that look. I'd seen it on weak men in bars, the ones who got too comfortable before a fight broke out. Samuel and I weren't friends, not exactly, but we'd crossed paths enough. His wife, Vanessa, had been on a few committees with Molly. We'd had them over for dinner a couple times, back when I still played along with the social expectations that came with marriage. He was the kind of guy who always had a story about how exhausted he was staying home with the kids. The kind who made sure everyone noticed when he was being a good dad. I never thought much of him. I set the photo down and checked my watch. Molly was late. I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat at the kitchen table, waiting. She walked in 20 minutes later, carrying a grocery bag. She looked surprised to see me. "You're home early." I took a sip of my drink. "You're home late?" She hesitated, then set the bag down. I ran into a friend. We got talking. I nodded slow. "Samuel?" The way her breath caught was all the answer I needed. She recovered fast, pressing her lips together. "What?" I slid the photo across the table. She looked at it but didn't touch it. "I don't know where this came from," she said. "That's not an answer." Her jaw tightened. "Are you having me followed?" I leaned back in my chair. "Should I be?" A long silence stretched between us. Finally, she shook her head and picked up the grocery bag. "I'm not doing this with you right now." She walked past me. I didn't stop her. I sat there for a while after she left the room, rolling my glass between my fingers. I'd spent my life learning how to track things. People, movements, patterns. The truth wasn't hard to find when you knew where to look. I wasn't looking for explanations. I was looking for confirmation. I left the photo on the table and went outside. The night air was cold, sharp enough to clear my head. The wind carried the smell of pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that settled deep in your lungs. I stood on the porch, listening. No distant gunfire. No engines running too close. Just the quiet hum of a town winding down for the night. Molly was inside, moving around the kitchen, putting away groceries, keeping her hands busy. She wasn't stupid. She knew what that picture meant. Knew I wasn't the kind of man to let something like this slide. But she also knew I wasn't reckless. I wouldn't storm in, demand answers, throw things around like some idiot in a bad marriage drama. I was patient. And patience made people show their true colors. I pulled my phone from my pocket and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I needed. Garrett O'Connor. Ex-cop, now a private investigator. The kind of guy who had seen it all and cared about none of it. I called him. He picked up on the second ring. "Fisher," he said, his voice as dry as the Montana dirt. "Been a while." "Need a job done," I said. "Discreet. Aren't they always?" He sighed. "Who's the target?" "Samuel Lewis." "My wife." A pause. Then a small, knowing chuckle. "Messy. All right, what are we looking at?" "I want times, locations. No speculation, just facts." "You want the full deal of photos, video?" I thought about that. No, I didn't need to see it. Seeing it wouldn't change anything. Just confirmation. Garrett exhaled like he was lighting a cigarette. "Give me a few days." I hung up and slipped the phone back into my pocket. A few days was fine. I had patience. When I walked back inside, Molly was sitting at the table, staring at her untouched glass of wine. She looked up when I entered, studying my face like she was waiting for me to explode. I didn't. That wasn't my way. "You're not going to say anything?" she asked. "Nothing to say," I replied, opening the fridge. "Long day tomorrow." She watched me, waiting for something more. When she didn't get it, she grabbed her glass and left the room. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close before I pulled out a notepad and started writing. Patterns. That was the key. Molly wasn't careless, but she was predictable. I already knew some of it, her usual routes, the bookstore she liked, the cafe where she met friends. I listed everything, marking potential gaps in her schedule. She had already made a mistake, and mistakes had patterns too. The next morning, I acted like nothing was different. That was the advantage of discipline. No wasted movement, no reaction that could be used against me. I left for work as usual, took a few calls, checked in with a client who wanted an upgraded security system for his ranch. Normal things. Routine kept people comfortable. And comfortable people made mistakes. By noon, I parked outside the cafe in town, the one in the picture. Ordered a black coffee, sat by the window. I wasn't there to make a scene. I was there to see, to understand. Molly wasn't there. Not yet, but I wasn't in a rush. I had time. Half an hour later, she arrived. Alone at first. She ordered tea, always the same thing, chamomile, no sugar. She sat by the window, checking her phone, glancing toward the entrance like she was waiting for someone. Samuel showed up 7 minutes later, a kid on his hip. His youngest, the one with the messy hair and the toy car always clutched in his fist. I hadn't expected that. A man who brought his child to a meeting like this was either stupid or comfortable. Maybe both. They sat across from each other, talking. It wasn't physical, not here, not in public. But the way they leaned in, the way Molly tucked her hair behind her ear while Samuel talked, the way his knee bounced under the table like he was nervous but excited. It was enough. I watched. I learned. Then I left. By the time I got back to my truck, I knew. It wasn't a question anymore. I didn't go home right away. I drove out of town, past the gas stations and chain restaurants, past the last stoplight, until the road turned to gravel. Kept driving until the cell service cut out and the only sound was my tires over dirt and the occasional rustle of wind through the pines. I pulled over at a clearing I used for hunting season, killed the engine, and sat there with my hands on the wheel. I confirmed what I needed. Now it was about control. I wasn't the kind of man to cry, yell, or beg. Those things wouldn't fix anything, and they wouldn't make me feel better. I'd learned long ago that emotions were just distractions if you didn't know how to use them. But there was a difference between reacting and responding. Reactions were messy. Responses were calculated. I'd spent my life mastering the latter. Samuel had been comfortable enough to bring his kid along. That meant he didn't think there were any consequences. He saw himself as safe. A man like that wasn't ready for someone like me. I pulled out my phone, called Garrett. He picked up after one ring this time. That was fast, he said. I already know, I told him. Now I need proof. Garrett didn't ask questions. You want it discreet? Or you want it loud? Discreet for now. Loud later. Smart, he said. I'll get you what you need. I hung up and leaned back against the headrest, looking at the treeline. I could already see the path ahead. Molly had spent 23 years with me. She knew I was deliberate. She also knew I wasn't the kind of man to let things slide. If she was still pretending nothing was happening, it was because she thought she had control over the story. Thought she could dictate the terms. She was wrong. By the time I got home, she was already asleep. I didn't bother waking her. In the morning, I acted the same as always. Kissed her on the cheek. Told her I'd be home late. She smiled, a little too relieved. She thought she was in the clear. At the office, I made a call to another contact, Mason Jacobs, a guy who ran a podcast on men's issues, divorce, and everything in between. He had a decent following, the kind of audience that didn't take kindly to betrayal. I didn't use my name. Just told him I had a story he'd want to hear. Told him I'd send proof soon. By lunch, Garrett had already sent me a file. Photos, timestamps, everything. The rental house they used was in a quiet neighborhood outside town, the kind of place where nobody asked questions. Garrett had them on camera going in, coming out, separate cars, careful movements. I forwarded a few to Mason, along with a written account. Put this out there, I wrote. People should know how comfortable men like this get. Mason responded a few minutes later. Consider it done. That night, I sat across from Molly at the dinner table. She was talking about some book she'd read, something philosophical. She thought everything was normal. I let her talk, let her think she was in control. I almost smiled. She had no idea what was coming. 2 days later, the podcast went live. Mason didn't name names, but the story was detailed enough that anyone in town who listened would start making connections. A faithful husband, a wife who craved intellectual stimulation, a stay-at-home dad who felt underappreciated. A quiet affair playing out in coffee shops and rental houses. The comments section lit up. Men talking about how they'd been through the same, how predictable it all was. Some of them guessed locations, guessed names. It didn't take long for whispers to start spreading. I stayed quiet, kept my routine the same. Molly hadn't mentioned anything about the podcast yet. Maybe she hadn't heard it. Maybe she had, but she was waiting for me to bring it up. Either way, it didn't matter. The real play was already in motion. I booked a family gathering at a lodge in Glacier National Park, an excuse to bring everyone together. Molly's parents, her siblings, friends who had known us for years. Sent out invitations like everything was normal. Meanwhile, I made sure Samuel's wife, Vanessa, got the right kind of message. A carefully printed envelope left in her mailbox. Inside, a single photo of her husband unlocking the door to the rental house, time-stamped. No note. Just enough to make her start asking questions. By the time the gathering rolled around, the pressure was already building. I could see it on Molly's face. She was restless, distracted, checking her phone more than usual. We arrived at the lodge late afternoon. People were already settled in, laughing, catching up. Molly made small talk, but her smile was tight. She kept looking at me like she was trying to read something in my face. I didn't give her anything. Dinner was served just after sunset. Long wooden tables, fire crackling in the stone hearth, the smell of roasted meat and whiskey in the air. I made sure Molly was seated next to me with her parents nearby. Samuel and Vanessa were across the room, Vanessa stiff, barely speaking. Samuel looked uneasy, like he knew something was wrong but couldn't quite place it yet. I let the conversation roll, let everyone settle in. Then I stood up. Appreciate everyone coming out, I said. My voice was steady, measured. Figured this was a good time to catch up. Talk about family. Talk about loyalty. Molly stiffened beside me. I pulled out a small remote from my pocket, pressed a button. The projector screen lowered from the rafters, the lodge growing quieter. A few people chuckled, expecting old family photos, maybe some joke slideshow. What they got instead was a silent reel of surveillance footage. Molly and Samuel entering the rental house. Different days, different angles. No deniability. The silence in the room turned cold. Vanessa gasped, her chair scraping against the floor as she stood up. Molly reached for my arm, her fingers shaking. Felix, don't, I said without looking at her. Samuel was already turning pale, hands raised like he could somehow stop what was happening. This isn't what it looks like. Vanessa laughed, bitter and sharp. You think I'm stupid? Molly's father, a man who had always prided himself on his daughter's intelligence, looked at her like he didn't recognize her. Her mother covered her mouth, eyes wet with humiliation. I didn't need to say anything else. I sat back down, picked up my drink, and took a slow sip while the wreckage unfolded. Molly didn't say a word the whole drive home. She sat stiff in the passenger seat, arms crossed, eyes forward. Every few minutes she'd open her mouth like she was about to say something, then close it again. Good. There was nothing left to say. When we pulled into the driveway, she finally spoke. You humiliated me. I killed the engine, let the quiet settle. No, I said, turning to look at her. You did that yourself. She swallowed hard, fingers gripping her knees. We need to talk. I got out of the truck and shut the door behind me. Inside, I took my time. Hummed my jacket, set my keys on the counter. Molly followed, her steps measured like she was picking her way through a minefield. Felix, please. I turned, leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Go ahead. Her lips parted, but for the first time she didn't seem to know where to start. You think I planned this to hurt you? She finally asked. I let out a short breath, something that wasn't quite a laugh. I don't think you planned anything at all. That's the problem. She flinched, eyes flashing. That's not fair. I pushed off the counter, closing the space between us. Not touching her, not even raising my voice. Just looking. Fair? I repeated. You want to talk about fair? You had a choice, Molly. You could have told me you weren't happy. You could have left if you wanted to. But you didn't. You snuck around, you lied, and when you got caught, your first instinct wasn't to apologize. It was to control the damage. She crossed her arms again, defensive. I wasn't thinking about control, Felix. I was in. Selfish, I said, cutting her off. You were selfish. Just admit it. Her mouth snapped shut. I nodded. That's what I thought. She took a slow breath, steadied herself. So what now? Are we getting lawyers involved? I walked to the fridge, grabbed a beer, cracked it open. Already did. She stiffened. I took a sip, then met her gaze. I want the house. I want the boys. You can leave whenever you're ready. She let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. You think you're the victim here, don't you? I smiled. No, Molly. I think I'm the one who won. She didn't argue. She knew better. Upstairs, a door creaked. Our oldest, Damien, stood at the top of the stairs, watching. He was 15, old enough to understand. His younger brother, Eric, wasn't far behind, rubbing sleep from his eyes. Molly turned, voice softening. Go back to bed, boys. Damien didn't move. Is it true? I met his gaze steady. Yeah. His jaw clenched, his hands tightening at his sides. Then he looked at Molly. You should go. Her breath hitched, eyes wide. Damien. But he was already walking away, Eric trailing behind him. Molly's shoulders slumped. For the first time, she looked small. Alone. I finished my beer, set the empty bottle on the counter. Like I said, whenever you're ready. She left 3 days later. Molly packed light. A couple of suitcases, a box of books, nothing more. She didn't ask for a fight. She didn't even try to argue for the house. Maybe she knew better. Maybe she was just too tired. Either way, she left without ceremony, without a dramatic goodbye. Just a quiet exit through the front door and a car pulling out of the driveway. Damien watched from the porch, arms crossed, face unreadable. Eric sat on the steps, picking at a loose thread on his jeans. Neither of them said a word as she drove away. After the taillights disappeared down the street, Damien finally spoke. Where's she going? I took a long breath, scanning the empty road. Not our problem. He nodded, jaw tight. He didn't look upset, just resigned. He'd made his decision about her the night of the lodge. Eric glanced up, hesitant. Are we gonna see her again? That's up to her, I said. And up to you. Eric mulled it over, then went back to picking at his jeans. Inside, the house was quieter. Less tense. Molly had left behind little traces, an empty bookshelf, a mug in the sink, the faintest scent of her perfume in the upstairs hall, but the weight of her was gone. I stood in the living room, surveying the place. It was mine now. Fully. A week later, Mason sent me a link. The podcast had blown up. The story had spread beyond the usual listeners, picked up by blogs, forums, men swapping stories about their own betrayals, their own lessons. I scrolled through the comments without reacting. It wasn't about validation. It was about proof. People like Molly and Samuel thought they could do whatever they wanted without consequences. They were wrong. Samuel's life had gone downhill fast. Vanessa had filed for divorce immediately, took the kids, the house, most of the assets. Word had gotten around town. His reputation was shot. He'd been the lovable stay-at-home dad, the guy people trusted with their kids. Not anymore. Molly, from what I heard, had rented a small apartment across town, alone. She'd kept her job, but the weight of the fallout had settled on her. Friends turned distant. Family disapproved. She still had her books, though. That was what she wanted, wasn't it? I didn't check in on her. Didn't need to. I had what I wanted. The house, the boys, my name cleared. A month later, my brother called. We hadn't talked much in years, but he'd heard about the mess, figured it was time to reconnect. Said he was heading up to Alaska for a trip, asked if I wanted to come. I looked at the house, at the boys, at the open road stretching beyond the driveway. Yeah, I said. I think I do. 3 weeks later, I was in the Alaskan wilderness, rifle slung over my shoulder, fresh snow crunching under my boots. A clean horizon ahead. Nothing to look back on. Nothing worth looking back for. The fire crackled low, embers pulsing like a heartbeat in the cold Alaskan night. The air was sharp, clean, untouched by the noise of the world. Just the way I liked it. I shifted my boots closer to the heat, the weight of my rifle resting easy across my lap. Across the fire, Damien sat on a log, carving at a stick with his hunting knife. Eric lay back against his pack, staring up at the sky, counting stars like he had all the time in the world. Damien glanced up from his carving. You ever think about her? I took a slow breath, let it sit in my chest for a second before answering. Not really. He nodded, satisfied. We both knew the truth. Molly had made her choices. We'd made ours. I hadn't heard from her since she left. She hadn't reached out, hadn't tried to fix what couldn't be fixed. Maybe she was still in that apartment, alone with her books, drowning in the silence she thought she wanted. Or maybe she'd moved on, found someone else to whisper her theories to over cups of chamomile tea. Didn't matter. Not my problem anymore. Samuel had gone quiet too. Vanessa had stripped him clean in the divorce, took the house, the kids, everything he'd taken for granted. Last I heard, he'd left town. Some guys can't stand to live in the wreckage they built. None of it kept me up at night. Damien flipped the stick in his hands, testing the weight. You ever gonna get married again? I chuckled low and dry. What do you think? He smirked, shaking his head. Yeah, that's what I thought. Eric let out a lazy yawn from his spot on the ground. Good. One divorce was enough. Smart kid. The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks into the night. The boys had grown stronger through all this. Sharper. They saw the world for what it was now, no fairy tales, no illusions. Just choices, consequences, and the people strong enough to live with them. I stretched, rolled my shoulders, let the quiet settle. Tomorrow we'd hike deeper into the range. Hunt something worth hunting. Breathe air that hadn't been touched by a single lie. I took a last sip of coffee, letting the heat cut through the cold. Men like us didn't get second chances. We made them,